Yeah, I think that's probably, Anya, that's probably a good segue into introducing kind of your work and your ideas about just what is happening with the demographics in the United States right now. And we do have a Gen Y bubble of about 100 million coming down the road. How maybe you'll comment on how things are for them.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, I just want to thank Brett and the Pen Club for hosting this evening. Just let me know if you can't hear me. It's the last time I spoke with Brett in the room, I was sort of stumbling at the beginning as well, because I almost didn't know where to begin, because the person before me had been talking about innovation, using an example of the British Empire and what they had done in India. And I felt sort of, as an Irish person coming behind that person speaking, that it was a point that couldn't be allowed to just swim around the room unaddressed. And now I find myself, as a European with a European college education, unable to let the last point swim around. You know, I mean, all I can say is that I had the advantage of leaving third level education without being crucified by debt. And I'm not sure that you would have innovation in European countries if everybody did have the kind of college debt that students end up with here. Certainly low-income and middle-income families would be axed out of the education system altogether. And in fact, that is what you see happening all around this country. So, you know, one of the things I can sort of talk about is what is happening to the middle class and what is happening to low-income individuals and families, and then also sort of like painting the picture of different age groups and how they're sharing the burden of what's happening in the States at the moment. I mean, you know, just to use some government statistics, you have 1 in 8 Americans living below 100% of federal poverty. Now, 100% of federal poverty for a family of 3, just to put it in perspective, is about $18,000 a year. And I will leave it to your own imagination to work out how a family of 3 can survive on $18,000 a year. Obviously, not very well, and certainly not very well in a place like New York City. In fact, in New York City, it's approximately 1 in 5 who are living below federal poverty. And if you look at children, that number skyrockets. It's 27% who are living below 100% of federal poverty. So it's no surprise, or it should be no surprise when I say to you that 1.3 million people in this city rely on emergency food. Mind you, that's a number from 2007. As I sit here this evening, I suspect the number is much higher given what's happened over the last 12 months. But the number, the 1.3 million, had increased from 1 million just back in 2004. Now, I throw that point out there because it's this simple. What we call food poverty, what some groups call hunger, is nothing short of a barometer for what's happening in the economy. Hunger is not its own issue. It really is just a reflection of poverty in the country. Because the only reason somebody will come to an emergency food program, that is, say, a soup kitchen or a food pantry, is, well, it's not for the environment really, it's because they can't afford to go into a grocery store and buy their own food. It's as simple as that. And the reason they can't do that is because they don't have enough money, they're poor. What we have seen though is this alarming increase in the number of middle class, middle income households that are beginning to rely on very basic survival services. So research that we've conducted in the city has shown that in 2008, almost 4 million New Yorkers were reporting difficulty affording food. Now, if you live in the city, you're going to say to me, sure, that's half the city. Sure, that's not very realistic. What does that mean anyway, difficulty affording food? I would say to you, well, that number in itself is actually quite meaningless, you're quite right. But what is very meaningful is the fact that it has increased dramatically in just the past 5 years. Long before the news of recession hit the headlines, back last fall, let's say, we knew that we were looking at a crisis situation, which has yet to completely unfold, I would add. But we know that, you know, back in 2007, it was just over 3 million people reporting difficulty affording food. And so there's been this huge increase in just the past year alone. But it was a significant increase of just over 2 million in 2003. So really, it's not about the number of people who have difficulty, it's about people's perceptions, and it's about the fact that so many more people now feel that affording food is a much greater burden on their household than they did just 5 years ago. The other thing that's significant is that the burden is again on the folk in the middle. Because what you have is a huge number of elderly and baby boomers on one end of the spectrum, and a huge number of children and youth on the other end of the spectrum, and not so many of the rest of us in between, right? But what's happening is the elderly, and that is everybody over the age of 65, that is the only generation in this country that has a tradition of saving money. Like, they literally saved a lot. They aged into retirement with savings. And what we've seen over the past 5 years is that many of them, an increasing percentage of them, are spending down their savings. And the reason they're doing that is because their incomes are set, right? Many of them exist on Social Security, and their incomes are not keeping pace with escalating living costs. I mean, the cost of food alone between 2004 and 2007 in the metro area increased by 15%. And if you add in last year's numbers, it actually increased 22% in a 4-year period. And I'm just talking about the cost of groceries. I'm not talking about eating out in a fancy restaurant here. So, you know, and I'm also not talking about the cost of housing and fuel and all of the other basics. But I would say, well, this might not work so well in this room, but in most of the rooms I speak in, when I say, have your wages increased 15% in the past 4 years, most people say no. That may not be true in this room, but for most rooms it's true, right? So you can begin to see how difficult it is for most people to actually survive. So here's what we've seen with middle-income folk. The number of middle-income people who are reporting difficulty affording food has tripled in a 5-year period. The number of college graduates, and I mean college with a 4-year degree and with professional degrees, has also tripled, the number who are having difficulty affording food. So college education doesn't make you immune to the food poverty situation, and certainly being middle income doesn't make you immune to it. You see, the difficulty is this. In order to be innovative, clearly this has come out already in everyone else's comments, you have to have time to be creative. And most of the people that we're seeing, be they middle income or low income, they don't have time for anything other than survival. There's no time for creativity, therefore there's no innovation. But what's worse than that is they're relying on the nonprofit sector. And the nonprofit sector in New York City is a much bigger piece of the pie than even the financial sector. There has been growth in the nonprofit sector in the last few years, even while all of the other private sectors have been dwindling. And so right now, the nonprofit sector is the largest private employer in the city and in many parts of the country. So that 15% of people who are employed in the city are employed in the nonprofit sector. But the nonprofit sector is hampered by a number of limitations, and in itself it is not very innovative. And so you have people who are not innovative, who should be innovative, right? They should have the time to be innovative. They're not, because they're dealing with survival, and they're relying on a system that is also dealing with survival and not being allowed to be creative in how to address some of the problems. And here's a classic example of it. Nonprofits are sort of wrapped around the knuckles for having high overhead costs and for engaging in something as vulgar as marketing or advertising, which was mentioned earlier, and so they're expected to come across with equations like 96% or 96 cents of the dollar that you donate goes directly to services, without any conversation about how realistic is that. And so they stop being innovative and they just sort of follow the rhythms that already exist. And what you would then end up with is, if you look around New York City, most of the big nonprofits have been in existence for the past quarter of a century, some of them longer, and the problems that they're addressing have not shrank. They have ballooned out of control. There is more homelessness, there is more hunger, there is greater lack of access to education and healthcare and childcare. All of the big problems are bigger now for many families than they were 20, 25 years ago. There were periods in history when the situation was worse, no doubt about it. But we have never seen a period like we're going through right now, when most of the people who are impacted are families with children, and many of them are middle income. That is unique, and I would say that there is very little innovation going into solving the problem. And sort of to speak to the point that not all innovation has to be about making money, if we had a more innovative nonprofit sector, we would be able to deal with the poverty that is hampering individuals from being innovative in the first place.